everybody, welcome back to Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. We are at Spotsylvania Courthouse Battlefield. I'm Chris White with Chris Mikowski down here. We've got Andy behind the camera. Dan will be on in a little bit. Sarah's hanging out back there as well. So we're going to talk about the Confederate counterattacks that took place on the very early morning hours of May 12th, 1864 in the fight for the Mule Shoe, which then devolves into a small area known as the Bloody Angle, which is just a smaller portion of the larger Mule Shoe Salient here at Spotsylvania Courthouse. But before we dive into any of this, Chris, why don't you orient us to where we're standing and kind of bring us back to the story point?
So we're actually here at the McCoull farm. I'm going to ask Andy to kind of pan around because it's kind of a neat little resource we have here. You can see the outline of the old original farm building. It was a 2.5-story wooden structure. You can see the remains of the chimney there. Working farm here. There was an apple orchard, subsistence farm, one of several in this area we talked a little bit about in the last video. We're in the center of the Mule Shoe, which is going to stretch from my right all the way across the tree lines over there. I'm going to ask Andy to pan off in that direction. And as you see off in that direction, that's where Emory Upton had his breakthrough on the 10th of May. Check out our earlier video on that. The Mule Shoe is going to continue up and around to my right. The apex is going to be off in that direction from where we're standing, and then it's going to swing down over toward an area known as Heath Salient, where it starts to kind of level off again. If you come out and visit this site, there's also, you'll see a couple wooden buildings over there behind the bushes, which you can't see at the moment, but those are the remnants of the Civilian Conservation Corps camp that had been here. The CCC, I always like to call them out because they're the ones who restored this area, turned it into a park that we can enjoy today. So the last of their buildings is over there, is the park's maintenance shed today. So on the morning of the 12th of May, 1864, we got 20,000 guys under the Union 2nd Corps punching their way into the tip of the salient behind us, peeling open a mile-wide opening in that salient, flooding in as far as this area where we're standing here. Off to my left, Ambrose Burnside has been pushing against Heath Salient in the east face of the Mule Shoe. He'll hit Heath Salient later on in the day. And off to our right, Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps is supposed to be attacking against Spindlefield, but isn't. And he's going to get in trouble for that as a result. And as with the Federals weaving into this area after they've made their breakthrough, this is when Robert E. Lee is going to come to his headquarters. He's been at the Harrison House behind us, and he's heard the cacophony of noise. He's seeing a flood of Confederate refugees streaming to the back. He's looking around, wondering what to do, and his army now has a gaping chest wound a mile wide right in the middle of it. He's got to figure out what to do. First thing he's going to do is look at his second in command, Richard Ewell, 2nd Corps commander, who's in charge of the Mule Shoe. Ewell said he could hold this position if he'd been given enough artillery. He had 30 pieces packed along the tip of the Mule Shoe, but Lee had pulled them out on the 11th because of the rain and because he had misinterpreted some of Grant's movements, thinking Grant is getting ready to shift away from Spotsylvania. So Lee pulled out his artillery, and that created that opening for this breakthrough. And now Ewell is absolutely going off like a teapot on the boil, sputtering, swearing, cussing at his men who are streaming to the rear behind him. He's using the flat of his sword to beat them, telling them to get back in line, calling them cowards, extolling them to the front. And Lee, the very calm, cool picture of composure, rides up and he says, "General Ewell, how do you propose to control your men if you cannot control yourself?" And he gives Ewell a timeout. And he sends Ewell off to calm down. And instead, Lee's going to personally direct the Confederate reinforcements that are going to go into place here. Now, I'm going to swing around the camera this way so we can see off in the direction the Harrison House, which was where Lee's headquarters was, off in that direction. He comes up to about where the Park Road is. And there, John Brown Gordon, who is temporarily commanding a division, has got a reserve line. And Lee's going to look to those reservists to send in as reinforcements. And Gordon is just ready to go. Like, send me in, coach, I am ready. And so Lee's going to take Gordon's men and lead them in a counterattack off in that direction to drive the Federals out of the Mule Shoe. Except the men refuse to go. They start crying out, "General Lee to the rear, General Lee to the rear. We won't go forward unless General Lee goes to the rear." Now, you've heard this story at the Wilderness. The same thing happens on the 10th of May as Lee tries to lead reinforcements in against Upton's breakthrough. And again, same thing with Gordon's men. They recognize that at this point in the war, Lee is the indispensable man of the Confederacy. If something happens to him, game over. So they don't want to allow him to put himself in harm's way. So they only agree to go forward if Lee will go to the rear and stay out of harm's way. And Gordon, again, just all fired up. He's like, these men are Virginians. These men are Georgians. They've never failed you. They won't fail you now, will you, boys? No, no, no. The crowd goes wild. And so Gordon will lead those counterattacks in that direction to the east face of the Mule Shoe, linking up with James Lane's beleaguered North Carolinians. When the Federals broke through and swept down the east face of the Mule Shoe, Lane was already holding off some attacks from Ambrose Burnside on the east side of the battlefield. And suddenly he's like, whoa, wait, and he's got to kind of do a defense in both directions. He's been holding the line over there, preventing further hemorrhaging on that side of the battlefield. And so Gordon's men are going to link in, and they're going to start to fill in along the east face of the Mule Shoe. They're going to drive the Federals outside of the Confederate works, but the Federals aren't going to go any further than just outside, and they're going to dig works of their own. If you have the chance to come out here to Spotsylvania and you walk that part of the battlefield, you'll see parallel lines of works weaving across a single ridge line. Federals hunker down, they dig these works, and they're going to spend the day on the 12th trading pot shots with Gordon's men over there on the east side. Things here then on the west side of the Mule Shoe are going to go much differently. Lee's going to look for an opportunity to spend reinforcements here. I'm going to ask Chris to come on here. He looks like he's got something to say, and he always has something smart to say here at Spotsylvania.
More smart alecky. So the Federals will make it to this point. This is about their high water mark. They're going to make it down into this area. They're going to look around, and they can see that there are a lot of angry Confederates starting to form up. But I want you to understand that when John Brown Gordon, who is now a division commander, because we're having problems with the chain of command with the Confederates, we've had to bump up in the 3rd Army Corps Jubal Early to command A.P. Hill's Corps. Then we have to mean everyone else has to come up a level. So Gordon is now a division commander, 31-year-old lawyer from Georgia, and he has decided that when he charges in here, Lee has to work on the ends of this Union assault. He's not going to send them down into this big blue mass of Yankees. What the Confederates have in their favor is the fact that they have unit cohesion, they are fresh, they're ready to march in. The Federals who have come in here, there is no overarching officer who is telling them what to do. The units are all mixed in amongst themselves. Winfield Scott Hancock doesn't come within 400 yards of the tip of the Mule Shoe Salient. He will actually sit there throughout most of the day at the Willis Landrum farm. So there's no command and control right here. Robert E. Lee, for the 3rd time in less than a week, is now told to go to the rear. And on top of that, we now have aggressive counterattacks because Lee loves officers who will take calculated risks. That is what has been sown into the seeds of the Army of Northern Virginia, the polar opposite in the Army of the Potomac. So now what we're going to do for the Confederates, we start working in on the ends. And eventually they won't have enough soldiers to take back this entire salient, but what Lee is doing is buying time with lives. He is then going to take Edward Johnson's division, who I'll talk about in a second as we walk here, take what's left of them, put them back to work at a place called the Edgar Harrison Farm, and then in that far, far tree line, that is where they will set up what we call here Lee's last line. That will take the nose off of this salient, make it flat, what they should have done about 48 hours earlier. That is what's happening in real time. They'll pull those men back there, start working on those works, but Lee now has to buy time with lives. And this fight will take place over 22 hours, the longest sustained action here in the Overland campaign, and it will produce, over those next 22 hours, 17,500 casualties. So that's what we start to see. And the last thing I want to say is, before we walk, there was that orchard that Chris talked about, and there's a vivid account of an Alabama brigade led by Abner Perrin coming through here, of the men as they marched through here with Federals on one side, they coming through this apple orchard that was in full blossom and bloom. Whenever the small mini balls come flying through from the Federals, that knocked the leaves off of these apple trees that were white, and it looked like snow coming down on the battlefield. And that's what some of these men will go into the battle thinking that it's snowing on top of them, and they have a beautiful scene. Many of them, that will be their last that they see. So let's start to walk along here, Andy, and I'll bring Dan and Chris back on here in a moment. We're going to go through Neil's house, cut over top. Over in that distance that Chris pointed out earlier, Mikowski, That is one of the Civilian Conservation Corps buildings. That was a 1930s era building. Was not here at the time of the battle. It's a maintenance facility for the park down here, so they're reutilizing it. There was a large camp here at Spotsylvania, Wilderness and Chancellorsville. The segregated camp was at Chancellorsville, and this is where we would have the Civilian Conservation Corps doing a lot of work for us, for the federal government, trying to bring these parks into existence. Because Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park was not founded until Valentine's Day of 1927. By the time the Great Depression hits, there's a lot of work to be done. We're descending down into a small stream valley, and on the left-hand side, we're coming up on a bridge. You'll see a spring. That spring was used by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It doesn't have potable water, so please do not try to drink from it. But there's a sign down here that will give you the idea of where that capped off well is, or spring, and you can see the cement just off to the left. It is not a bunker. We didn't have any cement here or any sort of bunkers on the battlefield at Spotsylvania Courthouse, at least cement bunkers there, which some people think that is. But it was McCoull Spring. Little sign here shows you exactly what that is. We are marching roughly north-northwest, heading up into the Confederate salient, that large position that is a upside down U, a portion of their line that protrudes outward. A salient position, remember, if you haven't watched our other videos, please go and watch those, is a position that protrudes forward, meaning it is tougher to defend. You need more men, and it's easier to fire into. And you can concentrate fire in on it if you are the attacker, and that's what's happening here. Morning of May 12th, 1864, Edward Allegheny Johnson's men will be awoken to the sounds of federal forces coming across open fields, 20,000 Federals. The 4,000 or so men of the old Stonewall Jackson Division will be struck in that morning, and nearly 3,500 of them will be captured, including Ed Johnson, who's a big, burly, 48-year-old guy from Virginia. He was up on top of the earthworks, according to one account, his walking cane in one hand, knocking away bayonets, and with his other hand, knocking away the bayonets with his hand, and knocking his heads of his men with his big walking cane that he had, because he had been wounded at the Battle of McDowell in 1862. He is captured. Another man will be captured named George Maryland Stewart. His nickname's Maryland. His real middle name is Hume. But Stewart, also an old Army guy, will be captured up there commanding a mixed North Carolina-Virginia brigade. Both George Stewart, no relation to Jeb, and Ed Johnson will be taken to the rear, back to Winfield Scott Hancock's headquarters. Back there, George Stewart will run into an old Army buddy, a guy named James Walsh from the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, who's out there working as a military provost. And Walsh is happy to see his former commanding officer. Stewart is not happy to see him, kind of gives him some smart aleck remarks, and Walsh sends him to the rear. Here, Stewart then runs into Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock says that he's glad to see Stewart, extends his hand, and Stewart says he's not happy to see him, and he would not accept his hand to shake it. Hancock retorted, "I would not have offered my hand if it wasn't under any other circumstances," meaning, if you weren't my prisoner, I wouldn't shake your hand anyways, sir. Stop over here, Andy. Stewart sent to the rear walking in the rain. Ed Johnson shows up at the headquarters. He's cordial, he's humble, he's even given a wagon to ride it to the rear end. He and Hancock, who used to go to West Point together, actually, he used to be known as jokers in the old Army when they were in California. He was so humble, Johnson was, that Hancock sends him to the rear in a wagon, make sure he's taken care of. So it goes to show, if you're good to your old Army buddies, they'll still be good to you at this point of the war. But if you're not, they're going to treat you just the way you treat them. So now we have the bulk of Edward Johnson's division captured. James Walker, who's commanding the old Stonewall Brigade, he's wounded, knocked out of action. So within the first 20 minutes of this battle, 1/3 of Richard Ewell's 2nd Army Corps is off the table. What's left of them, as I pointed out, are about a mile to the south of us, building that new defensive line that Lee needs to build. Now, as we're walking along this trail, Andy, we're going to step up here just for a moment. I'll point out that we have a number of features out on this battlefield. If you walked along with us on our Upton walk, they're tough to see on camera, so take our word for it. But we're coming up on a command trench, which is right here. This would have been a Confederate command trench. And then about 25 yards in front of it, which we'll walk past in a moment, is the reserve line trench that would have backed up the main Confederate line. Main Confederate line is at the edge of the tree line, about 150 yards from where we're standing. And that will be where the main Confederate battle line will be here at the Bloody Angle. We'll go up to that in just a few minutes. Then you'll have a reserve line about 25 yards in front of us, or 30 yards in front of us. And then just over here, we have the command pit, or the command bunker, where these guys could keep an eye on this line. The officers would be to the rear in this case, so they can regulate the fire, bring up reinforcements, do whatever they need. If they would have got up and out of these trenches, the officers would have been expected to run to the front and lead by example and lead from the front. That's why we have such high attrition during the Civil War among the officers' ranks, from lieutenants up to colonels. So this is what we're looking at down in here. This area would have been much more open. Any piece of wood would have been used for campfires as well as fortifications. So this would have been much more open. And if you know where to look for them out in these woods, there are a number of latrines where you go and use the restroom. Dan, it looks like you have something to add, or you?
Yeah, let's go ahead and keep walking. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. Like, subscribe, share this video. Head over to battlefields.org and get a good sense of what we have over there. A lot of free content, obviously free content here on our YouTube channel as well. Now, Chris alluded to this as well earlier, that both sides are going to sustain roughly about 17,000, a little over 17,000 casualties here at Spotsylvania on May 12th. Combined, and nowhere is that more keenly felt than in the high command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Chris mentioned that Allegheny Johnson is going to be captured. George Stewart is going to be captured. Jim Walker is going to be wounded. But a lot of the Confederates coming in here in these counterattacks to drive the Federals out, those brigade commanders are also going to fall. Stephen Ramseur, Samuel McGowan, Abner Perrin is going to be killed as he brings his Alabamans forward. He is actually buried, and you can visit his grave in the cemetery in Fredericksburg, the Fredericksburg Cemetery, or the Fredericksburg Confederate Cemetery. And as we move up through this area, you can really get a sense to come out here to get a sense of what these Confederates were going up against as they're advancing somewhat uphill into this area to try to take back parts of the salient. You can see here the reserve line that stretches well into the distance. I'm going to ask Andy to try to pan in there as closely as he can. Again, it may not be visible on camera, but we do encourage you, come on out and visit Spotsylvania, walk these woods. You're going to find a ton of great features and fascinating features out here. But these Confederates are, again, moving through this area. Again, it's wide open, but the fog from the previous night's rain, coupled with the black powder smoke, is going to make visibility very, very poor. And I'm going to ask Andy to keep on walking as we follow in the footsteps of those those Confederate brigades that are coming out to try to retake this part of the line. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention another Confederate who, a couple other Confederates who fall here on May 12th. Junius Daniel, who we talked about in a previous video, or go back and take a look at our Upton's attack video. But I think the loss that Lee is going to feel the most on May 12th, that evening in Richmond, his cavalry commander, his eyes and his ears, Jeb Stuart, is going to die after being mortally wounded at the Battle of Yellow Tavern the previous day. So here we are on May 12th. The two armies have been engaged for approximately a week right now, and Lee has already lost two of his core commanders, James Longstreet and Jeb Stuart. Chris?
Yeah, so as we're walking along here, we're actually facing towards the northwest right now. This is looking up into the Confederate lines, but we're going to stop here, and then once we break through the tree line, because you need to understand the topography down here has changed. As we walk through these woods, everything down here, you'd have more trees. There are more trees out here today, but as you look ahead, you'll notice there's a little lip here, which will eventually lead up to kind of a flat spot. That is not what it would have looked like in 1864. There was a road cut through here If you may be old enough to remember where you would come down here and you could drive behind the Confederate lines up in the Bloody Angle area, well, that road flattens this out. There's also Anderson Drive off to the left, which will turn off the camera's left-hand side. That's been raised up, so there's been a little bit of a change whenever you come down through here. So if you walk this pathway as you ascend here, there would have been a small rise, but not as defined in 1864 because this is the changes that took place over the last 160 years. Now, coming up and out of these woods, I'll give you an idea, and if you've watched our videos, we appreciate it from the wilderness all the way down through here. You've seen a lot of woods so far. And you might be confused. We're trying to keep you oriented, but the soldiers themselves were confused too. So as we stop here for a moment, this would bring you up to the Confederate line. If you notice, there's a civilian conservation era, 1930s era culvert here. So this changes the topography as well, but it leads right into the old Confederate works. There was once in the 1880s and 90s, up into the early 1900s, a house that sat up here where the two monuments we're going to approach once sat. That's the Landrum House number 2. That will replace the original Landrum House. Off in that direction, you'll notice there's a hill. That hill is naturally forming. That will lead you up to the Bloody Angle. The Bloody Angle is roughly a 1-acre area where the bloodiest fighting took place. It's an angle and a zigzag line here that the Confederates installed in trenches, and that will be the bloodiest fighting that took place. Many units claim they fought there because it was the most famous spot. Not all of them did.
It's like going to Woodstock.
It's like going to Woodstock, it's like going to Gettysburg, Little Round Top, all those places. If we look off in this direction, Anderson Drive on the left-hand side of your screen will follow roughly where the Confederate line sat. In that far knoll in the far distance, that is where we had our breakthrough with Emory-Upton. You'll notice how this is a punch bowl, this is a valley, this is a naturally occurring valley that comes down through here. So some of the Confederates could see for perhaps a quarter of a mile, and then the line turns backwards. You'll lose your sight on your left, and the same thing happens here if you're a Confederate on the right. Federals are coming towards the screen. Confederates, backs would be to you. Federals coming towards us. Chris?
So we talked about Junius Daniels being on the other side, kind of staunching the breach. On this side, it was Junius Daniels, or James Lane's over there, excuse me, and Junius Daniels on this side. Daniels gets shot through the bowels. He will die, but his men hold. And as Lee sends in reinforcements on this side of the salient, first guy is going to send it are Stephen Ramseur's North Carolinians. Ramseur will get shot down leading that charge.
That's surprising that Stephen Ramseur was shot on a battlefield.
And it's going to be even more surprising some of the other characters here. Sam McGowan, whose monument's coming up in just a second, one of the great bullet magnets of the entire Civil War, he's also going to get shot. Ramseur gets shot down, but his men will connect. They'll get to that interior line of works that Chris showed you and then continue out to the exterior line of works. And then they're going to begin pushing their way up in this direction. As Chris mentioned, Lee is working the edges to try to get them closed. You can't go straight up the middle because your men would be susceptible to enfilading fire on both flanks. So he's got to work these edges and try to close this gap. So after Ramseur's guys get in and they begin pushing their way in this direction, Abner Perrin's Alabamians are going to go in. Perrin says he's either coming back alive, Major General, or a dead brigadier. And he comes back a dead brigadier. He's buried in the Fredericksburg City Cemetery in the Confederate section. But his men connect, continue to drive up in this direction. Then we have Harris's Mississippians, about 800 of them, crazy guys with camp hatchets running into battle. Can imagine that coming at you. They're going to connect, begin pushing up in this direction, driving Federals out of the works. The bullet magnet, Sam McGowan's going to come in. And here from Andy, just a second, I'll have you pan over here. You can see the South Carolinians martini shaker shaped monument here behind us, or it looks like a coffin, one of the two. But McGowan's men come in, connect, and begin pushing their way up in this direction too. And of course, we can see in the course of these Confederate counterattacks, as these commanders are going down, you say they lead from the front, so it becomes an occupational hazard to sustain this. And they're going to go through not just these brigade commanders, but their replacements are going to get shot. And there's going to be a terrible attrition in leadership. But at least these guys have a specific objective, whereas the Federals up to this point really hadn't.
Yeah, so the Federal line on their side is basically break the Confederate line. And then when Grant finds out that the Confederate line is broken, pile more men in. And that's what he's going to try to do. He will start shifting the 6th Corps up into this area. He'll start shifting the 5th Corps into this area. And he creates a huge traffic jam where they keep trying to go into one spot. And the problem that the Federals had run into is they had lost all their momentum. They had broken a massive wide, half-mile wide, roughly 1 mile deep gash in this Confederate line, but now they're being pushed back into a smaller and smaller, more confined area. The Confederates, on the other hand, as Chris Mikowski pointed out, they have a defined role, and that is to take back this real estate, buy time with lives so Lee can rebuild that fortifications below us, and we can reestablish a better defensive line once this fighting takes place. And you might think we're joking about bullet magnets and things. If you look at some commanders like William Dorsey Pender, Stephen Ramseur, Samuel McGowan, John Rogers Cook, they enter a battle, they seem to be hit almost immediately by a piece of shrapnel, a mini ball, something like that. It's a miracle that some of them actually survived the war. Pender and Ramseur do not. So as we're moving into here, they have that objective. Now, the way they work into here is very simple. Down this line, as I mentioned earlier in our video, what will happen is Lee's men will start working on the ends. So Ramseur's men, as they start making their way back into those fortifications, they will literally jump into some of these fortifications and toss Federals out because that's how close in the fighting will be. The Federals won't go far. They'll go on one side of the works with the Confederates on the other side, and for the next 18 or so hours, they will be lifting up their guns and firing into each other. They'll stand up on top of the works and throw their guns with bayonets on it like javelins. It will become savage fighting. That is what sticks out to the men here at Spotsylvania Courthouse. It is just hell unleashed up here. Some men will call it a Golgotha, which means a place of skulls. Another will say a saturnalia of blood. Some will call it Hell's Half Acre just in the area where we're standing. They have many descriptors for it, but it's going to be a horrible place to be. Ramseur himself will see a Union flag planted within the works, find a discarded Confederate gun, lower it, the cannon, and fire canister forward, spraying men out in front. Abner Perrin, as Chris pointed out, will come into action. His 5 Alabama regiments will take back a portion of the line, then we'll keep working our way to about this area. And once we reach this knoll, looking off towards the northeast now, this will pretty much turn into the no man's land as we get on the other side of that large tree, which was not here at the time of the battle, because Lee doesn't have enough men to take back all of these works, nor does he need to take all of them back. Remember, he's buying time with lives. Being pushed back out of here will be the Federals. Some of the Federals under Francis Barlow will start to hear their division commander screaming that he doesn't need more reinforcements, and he'll start swinging his sword at some men, because this turns into a massive blue blanket out in front of us. This whole area turns into a massive blue blanket. So what do we do to break this impasse? Hancock decides artillery is the key. So in the far tree line, which is roughly the Willis-Landrum Lane, he will start setting up artillery pieces and firing anywhere between 400 to 600 to 800 yards away into this area. His idea is to dislodge them with artillery. Because we're using direct fire, you see it, you shoot it. We're not using indirect fire where you have a forward observer calling back these targets. It's not as effective as it could be. So we push in close artillery support. Over top of this monument here, this closest monument, that's the 49th New York. There's another monument to the 126th Ohio. Into that area will come a section of artillery. Napoleons, their job is to decompress their barrels and fire canister up into this area. Try to push out the Confederates that way. Unfortunately for a lot of the Federals who are stuck out in front of these guns, they have to kind of inch out of the way. It looks like a blue carpet out there. And the Confederates who are at point blank range will fire out into that area and drop those gunners left and right. Nothing can happen up here. Nothing can work. Some men will make charges over these works and be pushed back. Vice versa. One man who was shot down was shot so many times, caught between the lines, that his body, according to his comrades, turned into a sponge. They could only discern his body due to a 3/4 inch piece of watch fob that was left on his body. That's how they knew who he was. This will turn into just a hellacious fight. Some of the more famous actions that took place up here is the felling of trees by small arms fire, by rifle fire. An 18-inch oak goes down, cherry trees are shot down, but the most famous was right behind me when a 22-inch oak tree was felled during this battle simply by small arms fire. This made such an impact on the Union Army when they came back here nearly a year later, marching their way from through this area up to the Grand Review in Washington. They came out and they extracted the stump. It wasn't on the battlefield anymore. It was hidden in a shed in town at Sanford's Hotel, but they were able to get that stump, take it back, give it to the War Department, who eventually gave it to the Smithsonian, and it's in the Americans at War exhibit in the Smithsonian American History Museum.
Chris, I just want to point out too where you're standing. He talked about this no man's land. In our previous video, as we walked across from the Confederate line, for the Federal line to the Confederate line, we walked through a swale that cuts across the field. Now this was no man's land. This is an area that has not been recaptured by the Confederates. If the Federals were just going straight across that field from that position to this position, that would have sent reinforcements into that gap. But that swale that we walked through earlier, that path of least resistance that Chris mentioned, cuts diagonally across this field. So when the reinforcements get into that swale, it funnels them to this spot rather than sending them straight across into the gap. And that's why this area becomes such an intense area of fighting, because as the Confederate reinforcements are fighting their way up this incline to this area, those Federal reinforcements are getting spit out of that swale right into this area. And so that's why this really becomes the center of the storm. And for 20 straight hours, the most sustained hand-to-hand combat in the entire Civil War is going on right here. From the start of the attack, it's going to be 22 hours. And finally, in the middle of the night, around the second and about 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., these guys are finally going to get orders from Lee to start falling back, because that fallback position has been finished. We'll talk about that in just a second, but I want to bring my good friend Dan Davis on.
Yeah, and one of those soldiers who's falling back is named David Holt. He's from the 16th Mississippi Infantry in Nathaniel Harris's brigade, and Holt leaves behind a fantastic memoir. It's called A Mississippi Rebel in the Army of Northern Virginia. And Holt tells us that he's become so exhausted through the course of the day that he actually falls asleep around nightfall. And he wakes up to find himself essentially alone, save for the wounded and the dead, because the Mississippians have received orders to withdraw, abandon this position, withdraw back to the new line. And Holt begins to crawl his way out of the bloody angle, out of the area that we're standing in, making his way using the earthworks as protection from the Federals. But as he's moving along, he writes to us that he turns around to take one last look at the scene behind him. And he tells us that he sees men crying out for water, crying out for their family members. And he writes in his memoirs, and this has always stuck with me. This is one of, I think, the most dramatic and yet sombering quotes that you will find in any Civil War writing. Holt writes to us of that scene, "I never expect to go to hell, because I'm sure hell itself could not beat that terrible scene." Now, people go to Gettysburg, they go to Chickamauga, they go to other battlefields, and they come to Spotsylvania and say, where are the monuments? There's not many monuments here at Spotsylvania. We know from a previous video, and go back and take a look at our coverage of the 160th anniversary of the Overland campaign, that this ground that we're standing on was preserved in the 1890s, the early 1900s, and then gifted to the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. I would offer up to you that there are not many monuments here because the Union veterans simply don't want to come back and remember the horrors of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Chris?
And I think that's one of the great reasons to come here today, is because you're walking into a time capsule. You're seeing what the soldiers saw when they first arrived here on the 8th of May, before war spoiled it. And so you get a sense of what they saw by coming here today, and it's not marked out with monuments and signage. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity, a gift as a Civil War student, to come and see that perspective. As Lee's men pull out, Federals realize something's up. They're going to try to pursue. If you've been following along and doing your math, you know that there were 30 pieces of artillery that were here. They got pulled out. As Chris mentioned, there are going to be 22 of them captured over the course of the morning. And so that still leaves a few left. And Lee's got them in position in this new line. And they're going to open up on this Federal pursuit and discourage those Federals from pushing too hard. And they're going to fall back on the outside of these works, even as dawn begins to lighten the drizzling sky. And the scene of horror that they see here is unprecedented in the war. Even as intense as this campaign has been this far, they've never seen anything like it. This carpet of blue bodies shot up across this field. There are going to be some 9,000 Federal casualties just from this fight alone, some 8,000 Confederate casualties, many of them scooped up as prisoners during that initial breakthrough. And yet the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse is only halfway over. We still have another week of fighting to go. We'll talk about that in our final video coming up. But really, this is just a landscape that is horrible. Men in these trenches, 3, 4, 5 deep, so wounded they can't extricate themselves from the mud. Many of them trampled into the water where they drowned. It's just absolutely stunning. People, when burial parties come through here, they'll have to scoop bodies up and put them in the litters because there's nothing firm enough to hold on to lift the bodies into the stretchers. A lot of shallow graves out here over the course of the next few days. The rain will continue over those next few days, though, and it will wash up many of the men who were buried here. There's going to be an attack across this same ground on the 18th of May, and those dead bodies have washed up, and the stench of where we're standing now is so bad that men will fall out of line, sick, throwing up, unable to attack, because this is such a scene right out of Dante's Inferno. So lots more coming up, as I said, for the rest of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. We'll hit that in our next video. In the meantime, I want to say thanks to Dan, to Sarah, to Chris, to Andy behind the camera. And I want to say thanks to you for all you do to let us be out here and share these stories with you. Thanks for spending your 160th anniversary of the Overland campaign with us here at the American Battlefield Trust. Share, like, subscribe, tell your friends, watch more videos, plenty more to come. I'm Chris McCoull. Thanks for all you do to support battlefield preservation and education.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.